Hi, everyone. Welcome to Lori's Table. Let me tell you a little bit about our video podcast, along with my co-host, Coach Ray Scott, who is one of the top 30 Detroit Pistons of all time. I'm going to put it more like top 10. That's my opinion. But and he was also the first African-American to win NBA Coach of the Year, kind of a big deal, 1974. Thanks, Coach, for being with us again.
Thank you.
And I also have Bob Bennett. Bob Bennett is a longtime singer-songwriter, recording artist, and you know him from both Christian music and also the folk circuit. And now he's been doing live weekly podcasts, not podcasts, but live Facebook. And Bob, we've been having a lot of fun watching that.
Well, thank you. It's been fun. I'm a little embarrassed to say I've found a whole new life online, and I'm actually have done. If you look at it just as my job, I've actually had a better job under lockdown that I have going out and playing at concerts and stuff. So I'm going to have to figure out how to rethink all of that when we get back to something, approximating normal. But I'm just so grateful to have people that still want to hear this stuff. So.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun because of everybody in the comments section. You know, we're all hanging out together while you're playing and, doing your thing.
It's fun. It's I'm breaking off a piece of what you do so well, which is hanging out and putting people together and see what happens.
So that's the concept of our program. I grew up in a little suburb outside of Chicago. My mom was half Italian, although she felt full Italian because we lived in an Italian neighborhood. You know, I had neighbors like, Chris Bruzzini, Valerie Dinatelli, Primo Troglia, so it was very Italian. And we always had a big Sunday dinner. And so that's the concept of this program. We want everyone to join us at the table. We have lots of different voices, different cultures, lots of really fascinating people on. And today our guest is a jazz musician that I've known about since at least the late 80s, Tony Guerrero, and I'll tell you a little more bio, but welcome to the program, Tony. Welcome to the table.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. And Bob, it's good to see you again. Ray, it's great to meet you. And Lori, a friend of mine used to have a show. It was called Breakfast with Gary and Kelly. It was a radio show. And we always teased them that there was no actual breakfast involved in the show.
That's right.
I have to point out, I don't see a table anywhere. So.
Yeah, I had my virtual table, but those background pictures like cut your head off. So I couldn't decide, did I want to have a half a head or a background?
Well, it's good to see you too, Lori.
So I started hearing about Tony Guerrero because a lot of the musicians that I was hanging around with. And then I started seeing, Tony Guerrero and his all-star band at jazz festivals. Yeah. And man, Tony, you had some of the greatest studio and live players in the country.
I did back in those days, especially it was a big part of my growth was getting to work. First of all, I live in an area where I'm close enough to those musicians, that they are accessible. And I had a manager at the time named Lucille who, when I first started getting out and playing with my own thing, I was just kind of using my friends from college. And one day one of those guys couldn't make it, and she said, well, you're going to call this guy. I'm like, I can't call him. He's way too big and famous for me. And she said, you have to start playing with these guys. These are the ones that you have to start associating yourself with. Yeah. And you've got to start playing with people who are way beyond you musically. And so it was a lesson I learned very early in my career, but it was an important one because I did get to start working with some great musicians who I was nowhere near ready to share the stage with at the time. But, they need to work, I need to work. And so we were able to do that. So, yeah, in the time you and I met, there was a lot of that going on.
And before we get into more of the conversation with the guys, I want to give a little more background. Tony has worked in so many capacities in the music business as a producer and a composer, and of course, live stage, television, I think some movies as well. You've played in sessions, and he's prolific. I mean, he's worked with country artists, he's worked with rock artists, of course, lots of jazz musicians, and then some really interesting people like Jane Lynch, who was on the TV show Glee. And recently, you've been having a lot of fun playing with Dick Van Dyke and recording with him. So how fun.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Those two things that you just mentioned are two of the most fun, I don't want to even call them jobs, two of the most fun things I've ever gotten to do. First of all, I've been with Jane now for about 5.5 years. I've been her music director, and I can't wait to get out on the road with her and with that crew. And it's just, we have so much fun. And then certainly Dick Van Dyke, at no point do you ever lose sight that you're next to a legend. Like he's everything you want him to be,
And how old did he just turn, like 90?
94 in December. 94, yeah.
And he's still singing and dancing and doing it quite well.
I don't think you could stop him. Like, he doesn't put it on for the show. He's basically singing and dancing the whole time you're around him. Like, it doesn't stop.
So Bob and Ray, let me just read just a list of a few of the artists that Tony has worked with over the years. And by the way, I read that you have performed on 200 albums at least.
Yeah, I don't remember what the number is. Yeah.
It's something in that vein. So people like Paul McCartney, Joe Sample, Tom Scott, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, Billy Idol, of course, people we know, Bob, like personally, like Phil Keaggy, David Pack. I mean, the list goes on and on. So it's really interesting.
Well, when I was reading Tony's bio and reading some of the incomplete list of what's there, because I don't think there could be a complete list. I know further on the website there's a little bit more complete discography and list, but in the bottom, I'm reading down this, I go, this is like a great record collection. You could just say, I want to populate my music collection only with people that Tony Guerrero has played with, and you'd be fine.
Ray, he played with Joe Sample.
I love Joe Sample. In fact, we just watched Joe Sample and Randy Crawford last night.
Oh, really? Oh, and I love Randy Crawford. I would love to work with her someday.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, being a Joe Sample guy, I'm a Crusaders guy. I cut my teeth on the Crusaders in the 60s with the Young Rabbits. And that was one of my favorite songs forever.
Oh, yeah. I got to do quite a few things with Wilton Felder before he passed on. Yeah.
I know who that is.
Yeah. Amazing musicians.
You brought up something. I'm not trying to go for like studio musician confidential here, but I do have a sort of a question. I've had a little bit of a glimpse into this. I did one record where it was like studio player Nirvana. I mean, I don't know how it happened, but Jonathan Brown was producing a record back in the day, and we had Jim Keltner, Vinnie Colaiuta, Victor Feldman, John Patitucci, Flim Johnson, Walt Fowler, all these people. And to a man, every one of them was just the nicest guys. I mean, they were not only the most heavyweight players, but they were great guys. Of course, every once in a while you're going to meet a guy who's an A-frame, but generally speaking, is that the case that the great guys are usually pretty good fellows as well, men and women?
That's been my experience too. And there's, I mean, I can maybe count on less than one hand the big name artists who I felt were kind of blowing us off, or had some kind of attitude. For the most part, they've all, I think part of what makes them great and able to be great musicians is that they actually have a soul. They actually have and have compassion and humanity to them, and I think that's a big part of it. So that's been my experience also. For example, when she mentioned Paul McCartney, and I got to do a session for his album, and we got a notice from the union, like no photographs, don't approach him, all this stuff. We're like, okay, fine, we're just going to show up and play. The minute we got there, he came out into the room, came right over to us, talked with us for a while. After the session was over, came back out, picked up one of the trumpets and played. Like he was just the greatest guy. I bet we could have asked him for anything we wanted, a photo or whatever, and we honored our commitment. But that's just what they're like.
Yeah. Well, sometimes they have a necessary layer of protection.
Right.
You lay those ground rules, and then you find out that the guy himself was like, hey.
Right. And that's what you just mentioned as part of it. You know, like with Jane, Jane, in my experience, can't go anywhere without being recognized. You know, she's tall, so she stands out in the crowd, and then as soon as she stands out, everybody knows who it is. And so there is a point where just to get on with her life, or just to make her plain, we have to kind of guard her and keep people away from her just so we can get things done. But you know, her as a person, she's just the sweetest, greatest, you know, most loving person. So.
Well, and the good news and bad news about the close-inness, if you will, that's a very imprecise term, of media and video and all that, is people don't understand, and so they will mistake that as aloofness or whatever, when in fact, you know, they really are just trying to live their life as a famous person the best they can under combat conditions, you know.
Right.
So let's talk a bit. Now, Tony is known as a flugelhorn player, amongst other things, but we were all having this discussion. Bob and I are musicians, and Ray knows music really well. We don't know the difference, Tony, between the flugelhorn and the trumpet. Tell us a little bit about that.
Let me show you.
Ooh, cool.
All right, I'll give you a quick explanation of what the horn is, and then it'll make more sense when I describe the difference. So if you just play through here, theoretically, the sound is just going to go straight through this pipe and right out of here. It's not, none of this stuff matters, okay? And that's basically like when you see a military bugle, it's just one little pipe, and it only has a certain amount of notes that you can play, and that's all just done with your lips, basically. And when they added valves, it was basically taking a bugle and adding these little extensions to it, like these things here. So whenever you press a valve, it adds the length of that pipe, or this pipe, or this pipe, or all three pipes, or just these two. So the longer and shorter think of it as one straight pipe. The longer and shorter the pipe, the intervals, like the notes, basically change as you're, you know, playing. Like if you were to just play, I don't know if you can hear that. Can you?
Yeah.
You know, if the pipe was a little longer, it would be those same intervals, but. And you know, as it gets longer and longer, it starts to. So that's basically what the trumpet is, and then all of the width of the pipes and the lead pipe and the bell and the size of those all determine basically, for lack of a better way to put it, the brightness, the sound of the instrument. So when you look at a flugelhorn, it's really the exact same thing. You know, the shape is a little different, but you can see that I'm trying to hold it up to the camera here.
Yeah, you got it. It's good.
They're different sizes, and the pipe is much bigger, so it's going to be a much deeper sound. And that's really the main difference. Is it's the same basic instrument, but the sound is different. So as you start to go like a baritone horn or a trombone, and they get bigger and bigger, it's just a deeper sound.
Now, are the fingerings different, or are they the same and just different sounds?
It's all the same, just different sounds.
Because I know this is going to sound really stupid, but for a guitar player, it sounds like it's a moving capo, is essentially what the valves are.
You're right. That's basically it. That's actually a great way to put it. Is if you just play the strings on a guitar open with that capo, that's basically, without using your fingers, that's basically what you will be doing. You'll hear those 6 notes, but if you move the capo, those notes change. Same notes. And really, your fingers are very much like the valves. It's the same concept. I mean, music is very mathematical and physical, so it has, you know, the way sound waves work and all that's very mathematical. And so when you take a guitar string and play it, and then you cut that string in half, it's going to play the same note an octave up. So it's the same thing. Your fingers on the fretboard just change the length of the string in the same way that I'm changing the length of the pipe.
Yeah.
Tony, maybe you would play each of them a little bit for us, and later on I'm going to ask him to play, you know, a couple of songs for us, but let's hear the sound.
Just basic trumpet. And then the flugelhorns, it's a little mellower. You know, and you want to approach it a little differently, and think to play. There's no reason to play a flugelhorn if you're trying to sound like a trumpet, so you try to play it a little differently. And,
So is it in any way analogous to, maybe this is overplaying my example, but is it analogous to like acoustic versus electric, same fingerings but different touch?
exactly the same thing. Yeah, and really, when I've described it, guitar is really the best way to explain it because of all the varieties of guitars. And in the same way you have distortion and effects pedals you can plug into a guitar, we've got mutes that change the sound of the instrument, and it's all very.
I was thinking as you were speaking, that's the difference between Mangione and Miles,
Right.
and then you added the piece there,
Right.
that's Miles. That was kind of Miles' go-to, and it wasn't when he did Kind of Blue, but as he progressed, that really became his that mute became his go-to, and right up to Desmond Tutu's piece that he played, it was just
Right. That's so this sound is kind of that Miles Davis.
Yeah, kind of, and it's kind of a lazy note, but he does it so clearly. And Mangione was always, I mean, I love Mangione with the flugelhorn, but he was kind of bouncy and ethnic. He was kind of it was like an Italian real feel to his rhythm. But
Mangione was a great mix of Italian melody, like the sense of Italian melodies, Spanish melodies, Latin rhythms, Brazilian rhythms. Yeah, it's a great mix of a lot of those.
Yes.
When I was a young guy, I lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Seal Beach. I lived in the living room of this apartment. We were like 3 blocks from the beach. Young guys, we didn't care. He was a flute player and also played trumpet and flugelhorn. And I heard so much Mangione. That was my entrance. I didn't have any. I was Mr. Folk Boy. So I only listened to jazz by accident. I had no idea. But I mean, I'm telling you, we're 45 years down the road and I still hear. Is that like Chase the Clouds Away or whatever? I mean, that
feels so good. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels so good. Yeah. I mean, I still remember that melody. I still remember how cool that music is. Yeah. Which brings up something, Lori, if you don't want to go this direction, you just ring the bell that says, "Hey, pal, I'm the host," and we'll stop. But here's my question. I'd love to turn Ray and Tony loose on this. I would love to know that if you were going to instruct, if you meet somebody from an alien planet and they want to learn about jazz music, what are the first 10, 15 albums and artists that they need to go to figure out what they're going to be listening to from here on out? What are some of the names and some of the albums that you think are like, if you want to take somebody to jazz school, here's what you play them?
The guys that came up the Mississippi from Louisiana, and the #1 guy that came up the Mississippi from Louisiana, and they didn't wind up in Chicago as many people think. They wound up in Kansas City. But the guy that came up the Mississippi that is the all-time teacher is Pops.
Right.
He's the guy. He is the guy. Hey, there he is. That is, and if I'm wrong, Tony, please correct me, but that Jack Teagarden, Bix Beiderbecke guys, those guys that came up the Mississippi, no one realizes how profound they were. And a lot of people will tell you that they birthed the jazz in Chicago, and I always say, no. Before the Roaring '20s, my friend, there was a place called Kansas City, Missouri. And that's where they stopped on the boat, and they let it all out. That's where the great jazz musicians really, with their improvisations, what I've read and studied, that's where it really began. But the Pops, because of his personality, and I've come to find out, unlike Jelly Roll Morton, Pops had a propensity for getting people to get along, and jazz was so competitive in Louisiana, that people came to the sessions with guns. Oh, that's true.
Oh my!
Oh, yeah. It was. As jazz grew, it grew really in the underworld of Louisiana.
Now, is that if you take a solo at the wrong time, you might wind up at gunpoint? What was that for?
Oh, if you, yeah, it wasn't at the wrong time. It was too long. It was the famous Miles Davis quote with John Coltrane. John Coltrane said, when I play a solo, it's so hard for me to stop because I feel so good playing a solo. And he says, I don't know what to do. And Miles Davis said, just take your lips off the horn.
Tony, why don't you take off on that?
Well, for sure, Louis Armstrong would be top of the list in terms of where you've got to start there. You know, and there were obviously a few guys before him, like his hero, King Oliver, and you know, but really, Louis is the first guy you really have to pay attention to, and what he did not only affected jazz, it affected all of popular music to this day. And there's I've had that discussion before where you can really break down even a modern day rock song or hip hop song and just show the traces of what came out of what Louis Armstrong developed as a young soloist in his 20s. And so it starts with him, and you know, it's not hard to make a greatest list because a lot of those names are really familiar to us. Miles belongs on that list, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, you know, there's all of those artists. So it's hard to say what are the 10. I can tell you for sure if we were invaded by aliens and they wanted to know about American music, the one album I would give them is Frank Sinatra Live at the Sands, because to me that album it's Frank Sinatra with the Count Basie Orchestra, and to me the Basie Orchestra was at the height of their powers, and they were combining everything about swing and swagger and all of that, and Sinatra was at his height, and he was every bit, even though they were singing essentially jazz and American songbook, he was essentially everything that a rock star wanted to be. You know, that album to me is just one of the all-time great. It's the greatest album ever recorded, probably. So I get a lot of arguments for that, but
Run for cover, run hard. I saw Sinatra and I have to jump in with this because you're just ringing a lot of bells here, but I saw Sinatra at Cobo Hall with Count Basie, which is one of the greatest shows I've ever seen. And now this is the opening act. His opening group was the Oscar Peterson Trio.
Oh.
Now think about Oscar Peterson, and then all of the Basie guys come out and they blow the roof off the place. Yeah. And then you add Sinatra. I mean, is that living the dream or what?
Right. That must have been electric.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got Coach on both Louis Armstrong and Frank Sinatra because he's a big Sinatra guy.
Now, Coach,
I'm sorry, I was going to say if he recorded it, I got it.
So just for the heck of it, and I know this is very much like a Tiger Beat kind of question if you're old enough to remember what the heck that is. Who were some of the guys you got to hang out with off stage? Because they wanted to hang out with you and you wanted to hang out with them. It worked out perfectly.
Right.
Musicians.
Talking to Coach?
Yeah, talking to Coach.
Well, my number one guy is Johnny Mathis. Probably one of the greatest gentlemen. And we were friends for my whole career, from playing through coaching. And no matter where I would see Johnny, and I mean, he's Johnny Mathis, and you know, he's like Muhammad Ali, you know, and he would walk up and say, "Hi, Ray," and I go like, "You remember me? You know, you're Johnny Mathis, you know, entertaining thousands and thousands of people. But you know, I'm from a neighborhood in Philadelphia that gave you Patti LaBelle, and so I grew up with these people." I shouldn't say these people, but the people that really brought a lot to culture. And that's how I remember them. I mean, they were just really great stars, but you know, I met Sammy Davis and he was nonplussed when I met him because I was 6'9" and he was like 5'2". And the guy that introduced us was Adam Wade. And he was mad at Adam Wade. He said, "I know why you're introducing me to this guy." But just you know, having been blessed to live in Brooklyn and Philadelphia, I got to meet really, really, really great people. But you know, meeting Doris Day and Walter Matthau in L.A. and
Aretha Franklin.
Aretha Frank, I literally grew up with her because I was a 22-year-old rookie and she was like an 18-year-old ingenue in Indianapolis, and I met her, and we're both from Detroit. And I was thinking when Tony was speaking earlier, there's an old saying in the neighborhood, the bigger they are, the nicer they are. And that was what I remember, particularly musicians and singers. And I grew up around the Motown guys, you know, that came out, the Funk Brothers. I knew the Funk Brothers like I know you guys. And, you know, they were just walking down the street people, but they sit down behind an organ or pick up cymbals or something, and they're like magicians. But music has always captivated me because of that cross-pollination that you get in musicians. You get this extraordinarily talent, but then you get this real humble, sweet person. And you know, Laura, that's why I'm close to you. I mean, I met you as a talented hostess of radio shows, and I'm like, boy, is she? And then I got to know you away from your talent, and you were just so extraordinary in terms of bringing people together and talking to people and getting people to express themselves. You're just this group you have here today, having Tony, that just proves it. That says a lot, Lori, in my opinion, about your character.
Well, Coach, you know, you're one of my heroes and best friends. So I can only say you're one of the greatest people that I've ever known. And yeah, we're fortunate to have these talented other friends on today. Tony, let's go back to Louis Armstrong, because that's another love of Coach. We're going to get on this, and we want to learn a little more of the history. And there's something that I read about you that you have also one of the largest memorabilia collections of Louis Armstrong. And I know we're excited to ask you about that.
Yeah, I started collecting stuff probably about the time you and I met. And it actually started, that painting was the first thing. Somebody gave that to me. And then because I had that, somebody else said, oh, I have this other thing you might like. And then little by little, it started into this collection. And unfortunately, I have to be on a stationary computer today. If I were on my laptop, which is shorting out on me, I would have been able to walk you down to where my collection is. But you can see it on my website. But I do have a pretty big collection of things, from anything from signed concert programs, and I have some stuff that dates all the way back to 1927, all the way up till the time he died. I have one of his handkerchiefs that he used on stage that he actually signed, but it's kind of faded out, and just a lot of great things. It's one of my little pride and joys that, you know, I've just enjoyed over the years. And out of that, like, I collect other things too, like those two things surrounding Armstrong back there. Those are original Fats Waller manuscripts. And over on this wall, I have a signed Duke Ellington, the entire band from the 1958 Newport Festival signed. And, you know, I love collecting stuff like that. I'm just a big fan of the history and, you know, all the names that most people don't know. I just love knowing, you know, I like when we talk about Basie in the 60s, I got to know Al Ahrens, who was one of his trumpet soloists for that whole time. And he lived close by, and he just died a couple years back. But, you know, those guys were my heroes, not necessarily, you know, like everybody knows Sinatra and Basie, but not everybody knows the trumpet player in the section. And those are the guys that I was always excited about. But yeah, the Armstrong stuff is way fun. So you can see a lot of my collection on the on my website. So I will do so. Yeah.
Well, what is it about Louis Armstrong? I mean, his style of playing, but what about his story that intrigues you so much?
Oh, well, he really is in a lot of ways, he's the American story. You know, I mean, he was born as poor as it gets in New Orleans. He was raised in a very dangerous, crime-infested area. He was arrested as a young boy and put into a home. And when he was in that home is when he started to play trumpet, and came out of there and literally became one of the most beloved entertainers and most important musicians of all time around the world. I mean, there was really, it's hard to find anybody who doesn't love Louis Armstrong, you know? And we all have opinions about every artist out there, but everyone pretty much genuinely loves Louis Armstrong, even though most people, you know, the average person doesn't know how important he was to the music, but the way that he presented music and just played with such joy, and it was just all there. But he also, as fun as he is to watch, and the big smile and the gravelly voice and all those things that are fun about him, he wasn't a clown at all. I mean, he was a serious man in a lot of ways. Obviously, musically,
Yeah.
he just had this God-given talent that was important. But I'll say this, especially these days, this is an important thing to know about him. But back in the 50s, there were artists, even as important as Sammy Davis and others, who were kind of dismissing Armstrong as a relic of the past. And Sammy actually called him an Uncle Tom at one point, because all he wanted, it appeared that Lewis just wanted to be, just make everybody happy and all that. But Armstrong stood up to Eisenhower in a very strong way, which that's a very powerful story, which kind of predates the 60s civil rights movement. But then all through that time, he was really important. And people like Sammy and those people who were kind of against him in those times, they came around and they realized how important he was. But yeah, like when they, I'm trying to remember the exact story, but at one point there was some stuff going on in the South where they weren't going to let this girl come to a school, and he basically pulled out of he was doing a government sponsored. I should have read up on this if I know I was going to talk about it. It's been a while since I had all the details in my head. But he was doing something with the government, and he basically had very strong words that I won't repeat here for Eisenhower, just saying, forget it. I'm not taking part of this until you handle this. And when Eisenhower did, and when they fixed it, he came around. But he was very strong about it, So he has a very big record on that, and yeah, he was a serious guy.
Tony, did you ever work with any musician, because you've been playing for a while? Did you ever work with any musicians that worked with him in his later career?
I didn't really. I guess I worked with some who at different points had worked with him. Max Bennett had done some shows with him. A bass player named Jim DiGiulio, who was Sinatra's bass player, had done some things with him. But for the most part, not guys who are in his band. However, two things. In 2000, I was in New Orleans for his 100th birthday, and I was invited to play. And I did get to meet Arvell Shaw and basically the remaining members of Armstrong's band who were still alive at the time. And I didn't play with them, but I just got to meet them and be around them and hear them play live, which was incredible. But earlier that year, I had put on a little Louis Armstrong concert here to celebrate his birthday. And through a connection, I was able to invite Danny Barcelona, who was Armstrong's drummer from 59 up until his death in 71. And Danny was the one who played on Hello Dolly and all that classic stuff from the 60s. And when I met Danny, he came to the show, and he hadn't played drums in 20 years. He's long past retired. And we invited him up, and he agreed to come up and play. So we played Hello Dolly with Danny Barcelona. And I'll tell you this, the first couple of bars, you could tell a little bit that he hadn't played in 20 years, but by the third measure or so, it was like, oh, that's the record right there. That's the guy. Yeah, it was pretty exciting.
That's
Hey,
pretty
Tony,
great.
maybe you would play a little Hello Dolly for us right now.
Let me see.
Not to put you on the spot or anything.
Wait, let me see.
I think he can handle it.
Here, but which is what I would normally choose to do that on. But
years. Yeah. Well, I do. That's one of my favorite movies. But Ray, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that as Tony was playing, I remembered back to, again, growing up, how the world changed again right before my eyes, where everything went from the sound coming up the Mississippi to big band. And it exploded in big band because people like to dance as well as listen to the music. And Pops was one of those guys. He crossed the barrier because Duke Ellington, I think they said the Duke, Basie, Pops Whiteman, what they would do is they would take breaks. And when they would take the breaks, they would have 3 or 4 guys or a quintet come out and play for the break. Well, what happened with Louis Armstrong and guys like that, they were so good in the break that the people didn't want the big band to come back. And so the promoters figured it out and said, these people are loving these guys. We don't have to pay all these musicians. We can pay 5 guys and pack the house. And Louis Armstrong was at the advent of that.
Yeah, well, he had a big band at one time, and there was a time when it became financially very difficult to have a big band, and obviously very expensive. And that's really when he birthed the All Stars, which is what he ended up performing with for the last 25 years of his life, was the Louis Armstrong and his All Stars, which was just I believe 6-piece band most of the time.
But he was I'm going back to when he was being paid by the band leaders and by Sinatra and Bing Crosby and guys like that. They would still say, Louis, when we take a break, can you just play a little set, And the word was what I read, but this is with Kenny Burns, who I love. He's a University of Michigan guy. And Kenny Burns said it was just these 5 guys made small group jazz as we knew it coming into the bebop era with Dizzy, and because Dizzy and all these guys came out of big bands. Miles, Dizzy, Coltrane, they all played with big bands. But they came and the saying by Burns was that Louis had started this and these guys were good like that. And they just said, let's just do it with the piano and the drums and the bass and the, couple of horns, and boy, we got it made. And were you part of that history at all, Tony? I mean, you're a young guy, so you may not have been.
No, and I'll say this, I was always kind of a small band guy. It wasn't until the last 10 years where I started really playing with big bands and doing the bigger groups like that. I always appreciated and loved it, but my heart was always in the small ensemble, usually a quintet, sextet, that kind of thing.
It's so interesting because when I was in Orange County, and that's where you still are, and Bob is, by the way, there were some pretty cool little like jazz supper clubs, and that was reminiscent of older days, right, Tony?
Yeah, I mean that, a jazz club is a jazz club. Like, there's a sense that a jazz club is going to be very tiny and kind of grungy and dirty, and I was very fortunate to play in some really beautiful clubs here. Cafe Lido, as you may remember, was a great place. There's some great rooms now. We're playing in a place called Campus Jacks, which is great. Used to play at a place called Steamers, which was, one of my favorite places ever to play because it was a small little place where people came for the music. But there's a big difference between a restaurant that has jazz and a jazz club. And that's one of the things that, I remember being at a place like Cafe Lido where Joe, the owner, was a jazz musician himself, and so he wouldn't abide by having people be noisy during the ballads, or he would tell the bartenders, you can't run the blender when they're playing something pretty, those kinds of things. So there's a difference in all of that. But as far as, definitely in the older days, that, a night out on the town was just different back then than it is now in general. And I wasn't really a part of it, but I've done a lot of reminiscing about what I wish I'd grown up under. But that scene is very what's the word, I guess very romanticized for a lot of us musicians to think about venues that used to exist like that.
Well, like you say, go ahead.
Were you a devotee of Chet Baker?
Chet Baker is probably one of my bigger influences.
Yeah.
I'm not as a trumpet player, I'm not a high and loud and fast kind of guy. I never really pursued that, and I don't really have that. So I like the pretty side of the horn, like the middle register and playing pretty. And Chet was one of the guys, Chet and Art Farmer. And
Mhm.
yeah, those are the guys that I love.
Yeah, the hot fast guys burn out.
Well, some of them definitely do. There's still some that, I mean, boy, Doc Severinsen is in his 90s and he still sounds amazing.
Yeah, yeah. That's a good analogy, but I was never a big Doc Severinsen guy.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, as a player, he's fantastic, you know. But I mean, there are amazing musicians who I recognize as amazing musicians who I don't necessarily have all their albums, and you know, everybody makes music and you get to choose what you want to hear and listen to. But boy, I sure can appreciate what those guys do. The guys that you know, who can do the things I can never do. I could never in a million years dream of playing like Maynard Ferguson, you know?
Yeah. Maria.
Yeah, that's always an interesting divide for a musician when you recognize that they have the technical ability, but they're just not your cup of music. And so when you get somebody who plays well and thinks really well musically, you know, and recognizes that the notes you're not playing are pretty important too, then, and you have that musicality, then it's like, yes, I've hit the jackpot here.
Yeah.
Tony, tell us what happens on stage when you're playing with all these great players. Tell us about the interaction. And I think I remember you told me a long time ago that, maybe in a fun way, but that jazz players try to blow each other off the stage. Is that true?
Well, there's been some of that, you know. I mean, actually, that's a big part of the history of jazz. Is you read about the jam sessions that took place during the first 50 years of jazz, and there's a great story about Charlie Parker being a young kid and getting up on stage, and he could barely play his horn compared to all the other musicians there, and they basically threw him off the stage. And that was part of what drove him to become what he was, is he was never going to let that happen again. And there is a certain amount of competition. And, you know, the jam sessions were very important for the development of jazz. For example, bebop, which came out of the swing era, is almost unrelated to swing in a lot of ways. It's harmonically more advanced. It's rhythmically different. It's melodically, everything about it is so far removed. But the musicians who are playing in these swing bands, like when you think about Glenn Miller and those kind of simple little swing tunes, those musicians after their gigs would go to these jam sessions, and that's where bebop started to develop, because the musicians wanted to do more and express themselves more and explore more things. And but then when you're in that environment and there's 50 musicians in the room who want to sit in and play, yeah, like the piano player would start throwing weird chords just to see, well, if this guy can hang, then we'll let him hang. But if he can't, then let's get him off the stage. Let's try, you know. So there was some of that. And I've had that happen when I was younger, and I'd show up and they would call a tune that they knew I wouldn't know, or in a key I probably wouldn't know it in. And it was just a way to test, like, are you worth having us, you know, let you share the stage with us or not? And sometimes I was, and sometimes I wasn't. I'll tell you one thing that's new. I was talking to somebody about this recently. One new experience about what it's like to be on stage these days is I am constantly aware that if I make a mistake, it's going out to the world. Because there's always a camera going. There's always, after every gig I do, it seems like within a few hours, I'm seeing somebody post something from it. So it kind of stinks, because you have that in your head, like you're playing, and if it's just a live situation, there's no cameras, and something goes a little wrong, it's fine. You move on and you just fit, you know, that's part of the beauty of improvised music, is you may not do something, you know, the right way, but now it's out there for the world to hear. Like it's nerve-wracking. It does affect your choices. Well, I should not speak for everybody. It affects my choices. It affects how confident I'm feeling in the moment. You know, how it affects how much I want to try stuff. So it's kind of a bummer.
So now I know, even as a folk music, solo guitar, clap on 1 and 3 kind of guy, a lot of times when I make a mistake, the rule was you just do it twice so that people thought you meant it on purpose. Have you ever gone for that?
Yeah, absolutely, I have. Or you take that wrong note and you try to develop something out of it. And
Right.
Herbie Hancock tells a great story about when he was in Miles's band and he accidentally played some horrible chord, and then he instantly heard Miles play it, and like go to it, to what he was doing, and then make something out of it. That's a whole different level of making a mistake. You know, was to be able to take that mistake and make something musical out of it.
Yeah, those guys could take Three Blind Mice and make it musical.
Right,
Another guy that I grew up with, Tony, in Philadelphia in high school was Lee Morgan.
Oh,
And Morgan was the wonderkind. Another guy played hard, fast, good stuff,
yeah.
and did a classical sidewinder. And I knew him like all my life, and I was always amazed that this young skinny guy could get on the stage and have such power over this instrument. You know, going back to what you guys do, that is so phenomenal to me. And when Laurie talked about my love of music, I had it because, you know, I grew up with these guys. I grew up with Bobby Timmons in Philadelphia and the Heath brothers. So these guys were like, just, you again, they would be like the nicest guys walking down the street, and you would see them get on the stage and they would be like, you know, it's like watching you with your instrument and you do hello, we're having a conversation and you can just whip out an instrument and do Hello Dolly like that. That's incredible to me. That's incredible.
Yeah, but I can't get a ball in a hoop.
Well, that's, you know, it used to be only 2,000 people came to see me do that. So, so it was a crowd around me.
Now, again, I'm famous for asking the Barbara Walters questions during these
You're
interviews.
not gonna make me cry, are you?
No. I'm not going to ask you what kind of tree you are. No, I'm not going to do that. But okay, so what's the guilty pleasure, the musical guilty pleasure that you would admit to, like, against all reason and all logic, I can't believe that I love this? Do you have anything that comes to mind?
I was just yesterday listening in the car. I was driving home from LA, and I made my playlist early 70s bubblegum pop.
So like
Bobby Sherman, Partridge Family, yeah, all that stuff.
House Hills.
Yeah. I mean, basically, you know, it was music I heard in my childhood, so there's obviously something that, you know, the little synapses in our brain connect to that, but, you know, it just makes you feel like a kid again to listen to that stuff. But that's what I was listening to yesterday. But you know, things that a quote unquote serious musician would generally toss aside, but I love all that stuff. Like I even just to listen to it from an artistic standpoint, the songwriting, the production of that music, you know, or the great, you know, Barry Manilow's tunes from that era, or from the, you know, mid to late 70s. Like there's a lot of really great stuff that you can mine from all of that, but it would probably fall into that guilty pleasure.
Yeah.
So back in, I'm just going to throw this little opera reference in here, but, you know, maybe jazz players blew each other off the stage, but back in the early days in opera in Italy, if a tenor's voice would crack, well, still today they would get booed on stage. Pavarotti, yeah, Pavarotti got booed. But here's some of these stories that I like, is that in Italy, first of all, they'd have fist fights in the theater. It wasn't this, like, you know, like high art. It was just the pop music of its day. And they would literally chase a tenor out of town if he sang poorly, and they would tar and feather people. Yeah. So that was serious.
Yeah, so
that's kind of the history of opera. But Tony, you've been doing, speaking of, you know, having recordings, but you've also been doing a lot of live Facebook stuff. And you mentioned Campus Jacks. Tell us about that. And then you've done all these fabulous videos lately with like Arturo Sandoval and different people, Brian Bromberg. And
well, couple of things. First of all, Campus Jacks is a great venue. It's in Newport Beach, and you know, aside from just being a nice space and good people, they really are trying to make something very special with the entertainment and connecting the audience to the entertainment, not just during the pandemic, but even before that. I mean, they're looking to develop that room, that venue, into basically an international entity through um, sending music out from like when you perform there, they're very often doing multi-camera capture, recording it into multi-track Pro Tools. I mean, so you get product out of there that's beyond what most venues can do, and so they're looking to develop that into really like a whole production suite, like a whole production company that can put live music out from a venue like that. So just to be a part of a venue that cares about the sound system, cares about the artist, has ingenious ways of connecting the audience, and that's already been great. But when the pandemic hit and we were all quarantined and the live music stopped, within a week we were on the air doing a streaming thing like this, but the guys in charge of it, they have TV backgrounds, and they're like producing content, pre-made videos and like personal interest stories and biographical things. And so the interviews, the live stuff is very much like this, but then it's interspersed with all this like high quality production stuff that they're doing. And it's great to be a part of that. And then part of that is that we've been able to do what is being basically called quarantine videos, which there's a lot of musicians are just trying to find a way to stay connected and put content out there. And so I did a big band, which was about 21 people, musicians and singers, and we did a big band thing of mine that we put out about a month or so ago. And then yes, just yesterday we released a tune that is an original of mine, and it has the great Arturo Sandoval on flugelhorn, and I played flugelhorn with him, but I followed him. And Grant Geisman on guitar, who was part of the Chuck Mangione band back in those days, and Brian Bromberg, of course, and Dave Tull, and Josh Nelson, great piano player. So that came out yesterday.
Tony, did you do anything with Celia Cruz?
I never did. No.
I have to ask because she and Estefan are some of my favorite singers out in front of big bands.
Right. I'm sure I've worked with people who had worked with her, but I never had any personal experience.
By the way, Tony has written quite a few songs over the years. He's written a musical. You might know him from that as well. And I loved the video you had where Dick Van Dyke and Jane Lynch they sang a Christmas song that you had written.
Yeah, that was, I can't tell you how thrilling that was. Let me say this about that video and about that whole experience. First of all, Jane she's a big stinking star, right? And yet she still has this mentality of, let's put a show on in the backyard, And so when we did her Christmas album, and then when we did this out thing with Dick Van Dyke, it was just, you would think that an artist at her level would be like, okay, we have to have the highest level production and director and cameras and all that. She's basically like, hey, Tony, let's just get your camera and let's just film it. So those videos from her album and the Dick Van Dyke one, that's just my little camera that's sitting over there, and us and me on, editing it on iMovie. And so I love that she's just so happy to just put a show on in the backyard, as it were. So that video was like that. And I can definitely tell you that first of all, having Dick Van Dyke record a song of mine, and then knowing that Jane was going to sing background vocals on it, and then being in a production studio. We were at a lot in a friend of mine is a photographer at Universal Studios. So we were in one of their lots, and I'm running the camera and directing a video. And the fact that I was sitting there directing Dick Van Dyke and Jane Lynch, and being the camera guy and the songwriter, the whole thing was really kind of an out-of-body experience. That it was pretty great. It was definitely a high point in my life and career. Just that there's a lot encapsulated in that video that you don't see in the video, and it was all just swimming in my head.
It's so fun, and I have to say, to this day, I will do binges, marathons of the Dick Van Dyke Show, and he would be one person that I would really love to meet. You know, I've met a lot of famous people, but there's just something about him. It's just, and the fact that he's so active at his age is really inspiring.
Yeah. He has a great book on growing older, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's worth looking up. And yeah, it's all kind of about his frame of mind and how to stay young and all of that. So
Didn't he do something with Carl Reiner and who was the movie director?
Well, they're all obviously tight friends, but there was a documentary that was out that kind of focused a bit on them, but it had to do with people staying active in their 90s. Yeah.
Hey, as we're going along here, before we get, you know, wrapped up and stuff, would you play something else for us? Would you be willing to do that?
Sure. Now, I had some background music I was going to accompany myself with, but it's not apparently working. So I have to think what I can do. I know what I'll do. I'll play something on flugelhorn. I'll play a little Brazilian tune that I love, and we'll see how it goes without accompaniment.
Did you write this?
No, this is a song called, it's known popularly as Black Orpheus. It actually has a few different names: Manhã de Carnaval, Black Orpheus, A Day in the Life of the Fool, and I think the way it goes is its title is Manhã de Carnaval. No, I can't remember. I can't remember. But there's a movie called Black Orpheus, and the lyric says A Day in the Life of the Fool, and I don't know how it's all connected, but I really should learn it because I love this song, and I play it all the time, and I don't know the story, so I need to learn that story.
Big Quincy Jones hit.
Yeah, he did a great recording of this.
Yeah.
Man,
That was beautiful.
Bossa
beautiful,
Nova.
Tony.
Bossa Nova.
You know, I wish we all were in the same town because, you know, we would be at some little restaurant or something now, and we would be able to have food and make Tony play for us all night. That's awesome, Ray. There's nothing like live music, huh?
Oh, and a big bowl of paella goes with that.
Right. I'll tell you, I've been doing some work with Arturo Sandoval, and every time I'm with him, it's a big Cuban lunch, and I'm like, part of a good amount of the weight I'm gaining right now is just from that.
Oh man, Cuban food. Bob, is that place still there in the Orange Circle in Orange County?
Yeah, Felix Cafe.
Yeah, I love that place.
Yep, that's what. Now there's a place here in Costa Mesa called Bea Cuba, and that's Cuban food. And the reason that I know it's good is that my wife's beloved grandmother, who was married to a man who was the consul general of Cuba before Castro took power. I'll let you know how long ago that was, how old Nani was. She went to that restaurant with us and she said, "Oh yes, see, very good." So you have to check that out, Tony. If you're on the hunt for Cuban food, there's actually something right here in Costa Mesa that's really, really good.
I'll look that up. We have a little vintage shop in the Orange Circle, so I tend towards
Oh, I
going.
love it.
But I will definitely check that out.
Yeah, tell us about that little store.
Well, I collect mid-century stuff, and our house isn't decorated mid-century, so a lot of it was just like I would buy it, be excited that I found it, and buy it, and then it would go in a closet or something. We just decided that was a way to feed my addiction. Was I could buy it, and then we'll go, sell it. So we have a little a space at an antique mall there that we.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that. What I'd love to find out. My son is totally enamored with mid-century stuff and like vintage Coleman camping gear and all that kind of stuff. And he's basically a Craigslist savant when it comes to getting this stuff. So we'll have to, as we get off, I'll have to find out about that and let him know.
Yeah, what's the name of your shop, Tony?
It's called Rat Pack Vintage. And you can go to Rat Pack Vintage on Instagram. It's probably the best, or there's a Facebook page and website, but Rat Pack Vintage on Instagram is probably the best place to find it.
What a great name.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, I have to admit, I had all my mom's like even 78s and LPs growing up and just listening to the Rat Pack. I mean, I was 10 years old and playing that over and over and over again. It just, that music really influenced me. And those guys were so cool, huh, Ray?
Well, it was, the three singers, which was Dino, Frank, and Sammy, and then they had Joey Bishop and Peter Lawford, and then at one time they added in Johnny Carson, because the Rat Pack was a much larger group than people think, and it also had women in it, including Shirley MacLaine. So the being a Rat Pack devotee because of Sinatra. That almost has a profound effect on our educational system in terms of music. I mean, there's like a chapter that's probably dedicated to the Rat Pack.
Hey, Tony, tell us one of your favorite old movies. Like, for instance, one of mine is Robin and the Seven Hoods, which had a ton of music in it, and it had basically that group plus Bing Crosby. Do you have a favorite movie like that from that era?
From that era, it's hard to beat Ocean's 11 for everything that's, everything about that Rat Pack era. That's really kind of, to me, that movie was sort of the epitome. Plus, knowing that it was during the making of that movie that they were hitting all the nightclubs in Vegas and putting on those shows. So they would film during the day and then go do a show at night and then, sleep in, film, show, So I can just imagine what the energy was like. And they say basically, Vegas would wake up every time Sinatra showed up to town. So I always associate that movie with the height of that Rat Pack era.
That's so fun. I'm going to have Ray and Bob each ask you one more question, and then maybe if you play at least a little bit for us, and then Bob's going to take us out with a song. But Ray, do you have any thoughts for Tony? Man, we could keep him all day, huh?
All day. I'm curious now that I've gotten the variants of the flugelhorn and the trumpet, and I see both of them in salsa. Like you were driving down the street thinking of your favorite pop tunes, Tony. I drive down the street sometimes thinking of me being from the East Coast, thinking of my favorite salsa songs. Como Va and Tito Puente, but that's what I grew up with on the East Coast. Now you're West Coast, but did you have any? I guess I want to say, did you have an involvement at all in that East Coast salsa mambo, cha-cha kind of thing?
No, not directly. I mean, other than occasionally on gigs playing some tunes like that, but nothing specifically. You know, my dad's from Mexico, so I did hear a lot of different music out of Mexico that could be very similar to that. You know, there is actually, I was just with Arturo yesterday talking, and he was talking about all the differences between when we say cha-cha-cha and
Yeah.
mambo and like all these music styles have their own very specific rhythm and thing that's very specific to them. And there are guys who are just very well studied in that. And it does get thrown into this umbrella of just being Latin music a lot of the times.
Yeah.
But you know, I grew up. Part of my experience with my dad was mariachi music,
Yeah.
and Perez Prado. He was big fan of his, and so just a big melting pot of that kind of music. Yeah, but not so much. It hasn't been a really big part of my professional life,
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And I can't dance.
Uh-oh. Well, welcome to my world.
So, Tony, I wanted to ask you, a good part of your resume is doing stuff in and around church, and that presents its own set of blessings and, frankly, its own set of challenges as well. How did you fare during those years, and do you still occasionally step into those situations now?
Well, working at church was sort of an accident. You know, as I came into my faith, you know, I always grew up with a certain amount of that, and my family was Catholic. We went to church and all of that. But when I came into faith on my own and started being at church, and then getting asked to play because I was a musician, and ended up in leadership and all that. It just at one point. I was offered a part-time position with a church that was starting up, and I thought, yeah, I'd like to experiment, you know, or experience doing something like that. And it, little by little, as you know, grew into more than just part-time. And eventually I ended up, long story short, and I ended up as the director of creative arts at Saddleback Church, which at that time became a full-time position. And as you can imagine, it made it very difficult. On the one hand, I didn't have to take every horrible gig that came my way on the outside.
Yeah.
I had a steady paycheck from my role there. But the negative side was, as that job became more of a full-time thing, started to become a lot more administrative than musical. And that's where by the time that ended, which, by the way, I was on staff there for 11 years, and my last day on staff was 10 years ago yesterday. Yeah, we just realized that. But in the 10 years since then, you know, I actually feel like I'm a little bit, let me put this the right way. I felt very called to what I was doing at that time, but I do know that where I've been in the last 10 years is a little bit more of what I've always felt like I was supposed to be doing, which is, you know, being a musician and pursuing all these different things. So I did some great things at the church that I loved being a part of. It's not something I would pursue doing again. I don't think it's where I'm supposed to be now in terms of a job, in terms of the profession. But I still play, you know, we still attend there, and I still play in the band when they ask me, and I play at my friend's church when he asks me. But I'm also happy to just show up with my family and attend church too.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I do a lot of work in and around churches, probably the majority of what I do, but I'm different because all I have to do is drop in and like not screw up real bad and go home and everybody's happy with me. So I don't have the challenge of dealing with the admin, right, and the fact that the squeaky wheel of complaining always gets the grease and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But the other thing is, it's interesting that a lot of larger churches are stratifying. I don't mean to get too inside baseball here, but they're stratifying to where there's like a teaching pastor and an executive or administrative pastor. But when it comes to the musician, you're the MD, you're the arts guy, you're the admin, you're wearing about 3 or 4 different hats, and you're not getting the division of labor that allows you to, if we would say that teaching is analogous to playing, and you could just concentrate on that, that might be a different thing altogether.
It's so funny that you bring that up because that was I was at church on Sunday at my friend's church, and I basically had that issue came up for me again. It used to be a big part of what I would teach and talk about at conferences, exactly what you're talking about. But it came up again yesterday where I just thought, why is it that the person who's the teaching pastor is also expected to be in charge of the whole church and make decisions about all, about what kind of, I don't know, what kind of decor in the hallways or whatever it is. All this stuff falls to this one person who may be the most gifted teacher, but why do we put that? It just does seem like there should be an administrative pastor, there should be a teaching pastor. So I've always been a fan of that, but definitely 100% in the music side. Like I used to make a joke that the job requirement for being a worship leader was essentially that you had to play guitar, stand out front, and wear skinny jeans. But once you get that job, that's only going to be 2% of what you do. And that the rest of it is going to be dealing with people and administration and scheduling and music library and copyrights and all this stuff that the guy with the guitar has not been trained to do.
Right.
And that's I think why, in my experience, as I was teaching at conferences and having people ask all these questions about, hey, these are the problems we're having, these are problems we're having, I almost could always identify that it's because you're being led by somebody who has no training in how to lead that. It's not that they're bad at whatever, or that they may be the greatest worship leader, but they've never managed an office before. Why is that their job, part of their job? So I've always, one of the things that I'll stop with this, but one of the things that when I started playing at church, it was really hard for me to go from being with my professional musicians on Saturday night who sounded this way, and then now I'm at a church where it sounds this way. And I always used to think, really, if we believe what we're saying, doesn't God deserve better than the nightclub's getting? Like, shouldn't the quality be here? Shouldn't we demand that the quality is here? And that became a big part of my motivation as I was teaching and doing conferences around the country, was that issue. And I wrote a book called Attracting Quality Musicians that talked a lot about exactly what we're talking about why these programs fail so often is because they're often led by people who aren't trained in leading a program. They're trained in music or in leading a song, but they're somehow put in this position as well. And it's, I think it is a big problem. So it's interesting you brought that up because it was a big part of my ministry at the time, and it was just very fresh to me last night or this past Sunday.
Well, you guys, I'm trying really hard to keep this program at an hour. We might have gone over, but it's so hard. We don't want to end because it's really engaging, fun conversation to us, and I hope to other people. And Tony, somebody asked me the other day, this last weekend, how do you know, one of my newer friends, how do you know all these people? And I'm like, it's because I was fortunate to work in Southern California in radio. And then I met Ray through radio as well. I've met all of you through my radio experience. So it's not like I'm going to seek out and hang out with all these like really cool people. It just happens because of the career that I was in. And so I feel really fortunate for that. And it's been such a pleasure to have you hang out with us today. Yeah, I wish we were at a real table and we could do this, but right now this is the next best thing, I guess. But you can find TonyGuerrero.com, and they can see there you've had a lot of albums over the years. I'm sure some are still available.
A good amount of them are still available online in some way, or my website should be able to point you to them if you can't find them.
And a lot of great YouTube videos. So Ray and Bob, it's been just another great session. This is so fun, and thank you, Tony.
And Tony, I hope I can be presumptuous in saying that when we get back to some semblance of normal, I would love to put a free Cuban lunch in your future. So let's think about that.
Already on my calendar, so you just let.
Okay.
You can't get out of it. I would love that.
All right, man.
Where does Mr. Sandoval live? Is he in Southern California?
He's in Tarzana up in north of LA. Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys so much. And thank you for joining us at our table. And we hope to talk to you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.